Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. My name's Sarah Hotchkiss, and I'm a member of the Latornell Conservation Symposium Steering Committee, and I'm the planning ecologist at the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority. On behalf of the committee, Conservation Authority, and the University of Guelph, I'd like to welcome you all to the Latornell Conservation Symposium's fall program called Re-imagining Conservation. This webinar is the third and the final in the series of events that will explore the changing ways we think about, define, and practice conservation professionally and personally. We also had a very successful in-person event held on October 17th and 18th at the Royal Botanical Gardens. Thank you to anyone who attended the event. It's been a great year for Latornell. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the Upper Thames River watershed is within the traditional territories of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, and the Nawakwek peoples, who have long-standing relationships to the land, water, and region of southwestern Ontario. The local First Nation communities of this area include Chippewas of the Thames, First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, Munsee Delaware Nation, and Delaware Nation at Moravian Town. In the region, there are 11 First Nation communities and a growing urban Indigenous population. We value the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and all the original peoples of Turtle Island. Please feel free to share which traditional territories you're joining us from in the chat today. Before I hand you over to the moderator for today's webinar, let's take a look at the poll results. So we've asked where people are joining us from, and it looks like the bulk of participants are joining us from Southwestern Ontario and the GTA. And we also asked people's affiliations. So it looks like we have a good number of Conservation Authority staff joining us, 44%, followed by municipal staff at 21%, and then a good mix of other people as well, and about 15% consultants. So thanks everyone for joining. It's now my pleasure to introduce your moderator for the webinar today, Leslie Rich. Leslie is the Planning and Policy Specialist with Conservation Ontario, and Conservation Ontario is the nonprofit association that represents Ontario's 36 conservation authorities. Leslie's work focuses primarily on supporting conservation authorities and their role in planning, Section 28 regulations, and regulatory compliance. Leslie has a Master's of Environmental Studies from the University of Waterloo and is a registered professional planner. Turn things over to you, Leslie.
Good morning, and thanks so much, Sarah. And good morning to everybody who's joined us today. I'm Leslie Rich, your moderator for this discussion. And today I'll be in conversation with 5 different professionals working in different areas in Ontario's planning sector. But before we begin, there are a few housekeeping notes for this webinar. First, all of our attendees are muted, and you will not be able to speak or appear on video. You will find a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. At any time during the webinar, I encourage you to type your questions in the box and press enter to have it posted. You may direct questions at individual presenters or the panel as a whole, and you can also upvote a question you like by pressing the thumbs up. We will be reviewing the questions, and we'll have time to post some of them to our panelists following the moderated discussion. So feel free to interact with others in the webinar through the chat. And to our panelists, just a reminder to use your mute button when you're not speaking, and of course, unmute yourselves when you are. The webinar is being recorded so that others who are unable to attend can listen at a later date. Our topic today is keeping up with planning in Ontario. We initially proposed this session back in the summer, knowing that the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force had released its report and the provincial government had committed to ongoing housing supply action plans. Fast forward to this fall, and the province has passed both Bill 23, the Better Homes Built Faster Act, and Bill 39, the Better Municipal Governance Act, in this session, while planning authorities are still working through the changes found within Bill 109, More Homes for Everyone Act, which was passed in the spring. In short, there has been a tremendous amount of change in Ontario's planning system over the past 6 months. While we will be referencing some of these changes, we also want to speak more holistically about planning in Ontario. Planning has always been about working in the public interest, including balancing the need to provide additional residential units while protecting people and property from natural hazards and maintaining clean drinking water sources. Is not a matter of one or the other, but more about how do we enable them both to work together, because they are all so interconnected. To get some more information about the audience, I'm now going to share a poll to get a better understanding of how our participants are currently housed. So please just take a moment to complete the poll. I'd now like to provide an introduction to our panelists. We're going to call them brave panelists because we're in the middle of some major changes being applied to planning in Ontario. And despite all this uncertainty, they are quite enthusiastic about participating in our discussion. So I'm going to go off alphabetically. So first we have Michelle Banfield, the Director of Development Services at the City of Barrie. Michelle oversees all land use planning for a municipality in a rapid growth phase. She's a registered professional planner with over 25 years experience. Our next speaker is Angela Coleman, the General Manager of Conservation Ontario. Angela graduated from the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa in 2008 and was admitted to the bar of the province of Ontario in 2010. She also teaches the Municipal Law Program for the Association of Municipal Clerks and Treasurers in Ontario. Thirdly, we have Gary Gregoris, the President of Land Development GTA with Kyvan Homes. Gary has over 35 years of planning and land use development experience, primarily in the GTA. He began his career as a municipal planner and then spent almost a decade in private practice. Gary currently holds a senior position for an established Ottawa home builder breaking into the GTA. Next, we have Aidan Grove-White, a director in the Municipal Affairs Practice Group with Strategy Core. Prior to Strategy Core, Aidan was a manager at the Ontario Ministry of Municipal Affairs, leading the work on public education and stakeholder outreach for the Coordinated Land Use Planning Review. He was also the Water Programs Manager and a planning advisor for environmental defense, in addition to holding a variety of policy positions in the Ontario and British Columbia governments. Our final panelist is Glen McDonald, who's the Director of Science and Planning with the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority. Glen is a registered professional planner whose career has focused on environmental planning, regulation, hazard land management, environmental impact assessment, and policy analysis. Glen started his career in planning with the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority before moving to the Inland Waters Directorate of Environment Canada. With the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority, Glen has been extensively involved in the review of planning policy and development applications. So welcome all of our panelists and thank you very much for joining us today. And I can tell the participants that this is going to be a very lively discussion. So let's pull up our poll results now. So as you can see, the majority of the people participating today do own their own home, while about 20% of people are renting. Although I think the majority of people participating today are home owners, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's reflective of what people in the province are dealing with right now as it relates to housing affordability and housing attainability. So thanks very much for sharing that information. So as we move through the webinar, each of our panelists are going to have an opportunity to spend about 3 to 5 minutes addressing 2 big questions. And I know it's not a lot of time, but we do have many more questions to look at as we move through the webinar. So I'm going to have to be fairly tough on our panelists today to keep them on track. I will pop up on the screen when you have 30 seconds left to speak, just to allow the next person to have an opportunity to do so. So our 5 panelists will start us off by addressing 2 main questions. The first one is, Ontario has a housing and affordability crisis, but what does that really mean? And the second question is, how do we balance attainable housing with other provincial priorities, including green space, clean drinking water, and safe development? We're going to call on our panelists alphabetically, so we're going to go ahead and start with Michelle Banfield. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Leslie, and thank you to all of you that have taken time out of your day to join this panel and listen to us. So I guess for me, in terms of these big questions, you know, home ownership in Ontario and in Canada really has always been seen has always been a goal for so many people. It's kind of what we do. You're born, you're a kid, you go to school, you you finish school, you get a good job, you potentially find a partner, buy a house, you know, all those sorts of things. And it just was always part of, then you have your own kids and so on and so forth. And so it goes on. And so they're always like anything you're trying to purchase, there's always a price point that's going to work for you and your family. And, you know, for many, many years, that was really a pretty basic equation. And the numbers for most people to own a home worked. And so whatever your price point and however that was determined, you know, for a time, you know, that could be tackled either by the housing type you were looking for, whether it was a single detached home, like a modest single detached home, or a mansion, or townhouse, semis, you know, all those type linked homes, condos, or high rises. So that could tackle some of the affordability piece, or geography. And usually, you know, purchasing in smaller towns or where farther up north, which is certainly the case for the city of Barrie for some time, although it isn't any longer. So usually for a long time, between those two equations, you know, kind of what you bought and where you bought it, really was enough for housing ownership to be attainable for most people. And people were trading off, I can drive this far, and, you know, those sorts of things. If I can live here and I get a bigger house for here, that kind of thing. But right now, that equation that we're all very familiar with just isn't working anymore. So in terms of it being a crisis, I mean, I think the first, the biggest part of it is just the shock that, you know, kind of what we believed in and the equation and that things would work in recent memory just isn't working anymore. And, you know, you often hear that, you know, younger generations are going to do better, statistically speaking, than their predecessors. And this might be one of the, you know, earliest times where that may not be the case, if we're speaking specifically about home ownership. So, you know, the things that used to be good enough to get you know, you get a good education, a good job, just might not be enough anymore. And then to add to that, the crisis piece is that there really is just no easy fix to rework the numbers in the equation. And so I kind of say home ownership or housing affordability and all those sorts of things, however you call it, it isn't, as I said, there's just not one way. It's kind of like saving money, or, you know, trying to go to the gym and switch your bicep routine out to get different results. You know, it's not going to be just one thing that is going to change it. And it's really a whole all hands on deck approach. And then, you know, as it factors into the second part of the question, you know, with respect to, you know, how do we, if it's housing at all costs, I guess, if you will, but how do we continue to balance those priorities? And, you know, I think we're seeing a lot of that in the news right now with Bill 23, where you're seeing the community members coming out and saying, you know, there are things that we value. Yes, we value home ownership. Yes, we value places for people to live. No one is disputing that. But, you know, we also have some core established values that we want to protect our green spaces. We want to ensure we have clean drinking water and a clean, healthy environment that's going to continue to thrive, and it should be protected and enhanced. So it really is just about the fact that, much like affordability, it's not just going to be one thing that's going to tackle it. You know, in terms of moving forward, we really just have to recognize that as important as housing is, it is really just one factor, and there are other elements that we want to protect, and we have to balance that out. Like everything, land use planning is a balancing act for sure. So I probably am shorter. You didn't pop on, Leslie, so I probably didn't get to my 3 to 5 minutes. So anyway, so we can move on to the next panelist. Thanks for listening.
Wonderful. Thanks, Michelle. I'll now invite Angela.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks again for the opportunity to provide some comments and discussion on the working relationship, as well as, like Michelle, I'll touch a little bit on Bill 23. So my name is Angela Coleman. As introduced, I'm the General Manager of Conservation Ontario. Before taking the position here at Conservation Ontario, I've spent a number of years working on development files, both with conservation authorities, municipalities, and others, including condominium corporations. And, you know, I think what we need to do as we go into these discussions is talk, you know, about the fact that, yes, in fact, we do have a housing crisis. There are a number of elements to that that require our thoughtful consideration. And I think that, you know, we can increase housing supply in Ontario without jeopardizing public safety. And I think that that is the crux of the comments, at least from the Conservation Authority's perspective. And a lot of that deals with the Schedule 2 amendments. And I think, you know, it's important to note that there's been a number of changes over the years to both the Conservation Authorities Act regime as well as the planning regime to ensure safe development with our partner municipalities. And I do think that, you know, conservation authorities are committed to doing their part to increase housing supply in Ontario. The proposed changes that are before us right now, though, in my view or in my assessment, have the potential to cause some potential challenges. And how those changes do that is by placing, in some instances, what will be new responsibilities on municipalities and others for natural heritage and natural hazard protections, as well as, you know, sort of natural resource protections that could lead to, and keeping in mind we have a long-standing relationship and a way of doing this in Ontario that's worked really well. We think introducing a whole bunch of changes all at the same time could lead to inefficiencies and uncertainties. And that would also result, you know, I think potentially in delays in the development review process. And I think that that's a consequence that nobody really wants to see from these changes. You know, what we've discussed as Conservation Ontario on behalf of the conservation authorities is that it's really essential that conservation authorities continue to be able to protect people and property, especially from those natural hazards as we see additional floods and we see across Canada, you know, the types of challenges that come from placing infrastructure and homes, et cetera, in areas where they're susceptible to damages from storms and other natural features over time. You know, I've had the opportunity to speak with governments across Canada about the good work we do in flood protection and other natural resource management in Ontario. And I'm just hopeful that through discussion, we can continue this this path we have in Ontario that's really built on municipal partnership and dialogue with the development community and others early on in our process. It's really essential that we maintain on the ground natural infrastructure, green infrastructure, such as wetlands and other green spaces, to make sure that we can reduce flooding and control those floods and flood waters to our communities. I do believe that whenever we make regulatory changes and decisions, I don't think people think that the worst thing can happen. And in my experience in over 20 years in the development review side is that those fateful days do arrive, unfortunately, and communities where we've either planned to fail or failed to plan have resulted in a lot of damages. So I think that if we have good discussion, good dialogue, we can together make sure that our priorities are met while at the same time increasing housing supply in Ontario. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. We're now going to move on to Gary.
Yes, good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I come at it from obviously a very different perspective when it comes to our housing issue in our province. I think it's been many, many years in the making, and there's no one real reason why we're in the situation we are, but there are some economic realities that are in front of us that are going to be a real challenge. For example, we have historically hit high housing prices beyond the means of most people in our province, and I think that's a real challenge. Our rental rates have gone, in addition to our ownership, have proceeded beyond people's ability to afford a home. We have double-digit inflation. There's been 7 interest rates just in this year alone. We have rising borrowing rates, so mortgage rates are escalating, and that I think is going to be a real challenge for any homeowner, new Canadians and others. And I think if you actually look at the statistics, we've had now reached historic new home sales in the last 6 months. And my prediction in over the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to be in territory that's going to take us back to the late 80s, early 90s. We have an aging aging workforce. So even if we need and want to build the 1.5 million houses over the next 10 years, we're not certain we have the workforce to achieve that. We still have significant supply chain issues. For example, there's a shortage in the GTA today for concrete. The cost of materials have not yet gone down, so the prices of the homes that we're building are under pressure, upward pressure. Our federal policies on immigration are working in opposite of what our issues are. We're not only behind the 8 ball on housing starts, but we are having many more, upwards of 500,000 new Canadians come to the country, many of which end up in the GTA, which is already behind the 8 ball on housing supply. And I think the COVID pandemic has really changed a lot of our entire work-life cycles. And it's changed our commuter patterns, our cities and our communities are different. We've put pressure, or people have moved out and beyond. People are moving to other communities outside of the GTA. And in fact, many are moving outside of the province. So I think there's a long-term implication on how we're going to deliver housing in our province. And Bill 23, whether you like it or not, it really kind of started with a results-orientated type of legislation. It's not a process-driven; it's a result-driven, and it's not perfect. There's no doubt in my mind it's not perfect, and I just think it's going to be a real challenge to achieve any of the housing targets over the next several years, even in the short term, without some real shift in how we approach our community, our land planning, our development, and I think it's going to be a real low point in the province, to be quite candid, not to be a naysayer, as to how we're going to accommodate these people and how we're going to provide affordable, attainable housing to our future generations and our future Canadians.
All right, thank you for those comments, Gary. We'll now move on to Aidan.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm thrilled to be here today. Long-time participant, first-time panelist. I think that the question of, the housing and affordability crisis and what it really means is, it really is central to our understanding of politics in Ontario today. And I just want to give a little bit of a wind up for why I think that, it's, there's I'll paraphrase a little bit, I'm sure everyone's heard the difference between a recession and a depression. A depression is a recession is when your neighbor loses their job. A depression is when you lose your own. And I think that when it comes to affordability, and particularly housing affordability in Ontario, a housing affordability problem was when it was happening to the service workers, when it was happening to people who are lower on the socioeconomic spectrum. They were the ones getting pushed out, and it was a problem when it was impacting our economic growth, which it has been for a long time. It's become a crisis in Ontario, and this is really important, since it started happening to me, like quite literally me, but also to my friends, when it started happening to my parents' generation's kids, and when it started hitting home for just average, everyday, middle class, and even now sort of upper middle class Ontarians are not able to live in the communities that they grew up in, and they're not able to raise families in the kinds of homes that they believe to be appropriate for whatever lifestyle they want. And I think it's really also important to focus on the work that word affordability is doing. Before COVID, when we would talk about housing affordable housing rather, we were talking about, what can often be called social housing, either a municipality or a senior government, sometimes the province, depending where you live, would provide housing either directly through ownership of units, or it would provide significant subsidies to make private units more affordable. During the pandemic, I work in development, and I saw, this suddenly everybody was talking about affordable housing. And where this shifted was towards the end of the pandemic, when people stopped talking so much about housing affordability and started shifting into something that is more, I think, widely called attainability now, but which is more about, instead of affordable housing, it's housing affordability. And I think that was a really important shift. And a way that I've described it before is that it was, this band of very legislature seat rich ground all around the 416 and the outer 416 and the 905. All of a sudden, those families were watching as their kids were not able to have their own places. They were, whether rental, absolutely not, anywhere where you can have an affordable lifestyle, but then also unable to buy homes anywhere near their family members. And so when that really started bearing down during the pandemic, the conversation shifted towards one of attainability or housing affordability in a major way. And so I watched as, politicians who I was engaging with on housing proposals says, yeah, I don't mean that kind of affordable housing. And what they meant was they wanted something, essentially, if I can put it bluntly, something their kids could either afford to rent or afford to buy near their homes. And I think that this is such an important shift, and it's unlike what I was dealing with when I was going through my own mini housing affordability crisis about 10 years ago. Where I realized I wasn't going to be able to live in the neighborhood that I wanted, given the housing options that were available. I wanted an apartment, but I lived at Ossington and Bloor, and there was no apartments at Ossington and Bloor. Today it's different. So my street now has many houses that have been divided into 3 and 4 units. Some of them, like mine, we have a ownership model where we own the upper half, the upper unit, and someone else owns the lower half, and it works for us. But that took a really long time. That was really hard for us to figure out. And so I think the affordability, what it is, has shifted, and we need to keep an eye on it, particularly when we're talking about politics. And then the big question of politics is really the balance, and that's what we elect leaders for. And I think that this is really one of those things that people on this call are going to be really interested in. And I think it's, how do we achieve both values? Do we have to balance? Does that mean we have to take a little bit from one in order to get a little bit of the other? And I think that the answer is probably not as much as we are. I'm not convinced that we are having the right conversation in order to hit the right balance. And I say that in that, there's a lot of conversation about the greenfield development, and that is certainly one way of growing our communities and providing housing for families. But only in the last year or so, or really within the last few months, have we heard about really getting serious about making better use of the urban land that we already have. And I think it's going to be on both sides of that. I think it's going to be looking at the way we grow out. There will be some growing out. Even under the last government, this was going to happen. But looking at how we do that, I think is going to be critical, but also really having an honest conversation about inward growth, about intensification, and making sure that our communities are ready to accommodate it in a way that is sustainable for a happy, healthy lifestyle, but also sustainable in terms of the infrastructure needed, both for day-to-day life, but also for the extreme events that we know are coming.
Thank you, Aidan. Let's move along now to Glen.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending this session during what has turned out to be a very busy December. As Leslie noted, the topic for this webinar was set at least a month ago, so before Bill 23 was proposed by the government. So when we first started preparing for this, we were very much focused on Bills 108 and 109. So when Bill 23 was proposed, it really gave a new sense of urgency to the topic of keeping up with planning in Ontario. Ontario does have a housing and affordability crisis, and the government wants to be seen to be addressing that. It's not unique to Ontario. It's certainly across Canada, and if not throughout the world. People just can't access the housing types that they want, and the solution is not easy or clearly evident. Amongst other legislation, I think the Conservation Authorities Act was targeted because it governs the work of really the only kind of agency that's external to municipalities that is still involved in the kind of environmental aspects of development review. So the perception, I think, is because we're part of the development and review process that we're a broken kind of, I guess, cog in the wheel, so to speak. So the need to respond to the ever-changing landscape of the Conservation Authorities Act and the Planning Act, it's hard not to feel that interferes with our ability to do the work that we really want and need to do in this regard. OPPI has noted in its 10-point action plan in response to the housing crisis that these constant legislative changes and regulatory changes in and of themselves are an obstacle to efficient review, development review and approvals. We are already implementing meaningful measures to improve development review timelines and eliminate duplication, which the province is attempting to address by removing us from some aspects of the development review process and then limiting the scope of our involvement in other review areas. The work still has to be done, but the current approach is to shift kind of the burden of that work to the municipalities that operate within municipal boundaries. So that is really a loss of the watershed or the sub-watershed perspective, which is necessary for understanding and mitigating the impacts of development that occur not only within municipal boundaries, but also beyond municipal boundaries. I recently read it was a 2019 Financial Post report on housing supply and affordability in Canada. And that study identified the lack of service development land as the most significant constraint on the supply of housing. It was also noted that the housing supply is constrained by the ongoing shortage of skilled labor throughout Ontario. So although these limitations are acknowledged in the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report, the focus on development approvals process does not seem to, in any meaningful way, address the root causes of the problem. So in Ontario's Housing Supply Action Plan, there are numerous statements about commitment to maintaining current environmental protections and the health and safety of residents. But many of those most recent legislative changes seem to be misaligned with that commitment. So those commitments are also front and center in the provincial policy statement, which we also know is under review. Ontario has a strong policy-based, outcome-focused and balanced approach to planning as defined in the PPS. And together with the technical guides, they provide the foundation for best practice planning. But many of the changes we are seeing to the Planning Act and other legislation also seem misaligned with the PPS. I would suggest that the planning and development approval system in Ontario it's not perfect, but it's not fundamentally flawed either. We already have the policy framework in the PPS for an integrated approach that achieves a balance between development, social, economic, and environmental interests. However, the environmental considerations in planning are now characterized as obstacles, I guess, to development, and the scale has shifted from that balance. So how do we restore the balance in a manner that achieves the province's objectives? while maintaining what we broadly refer to as environmental protections. So I've worked in this field for a few years, and I would say during this time I've observed what I would call a diminishing commitment to policy and kind of the related technical guidance that we can use. There's no longer any oversight to ensure consistency with best practices. And without that commitment to implement policy principles and follow the technical guidance that has been provided, I think the conditions for conflict and delay are created. I'll leave it at that.
All right, well, thank you so much, Glenn. And thanks to all of the panelists who took the time to kind of share your opening thoughts on this topic. I think what I took from what people were sharing is that it's obviously a multifaceted issue and very complex. People have commented that it took some time to get us where we are, and so we shouldn't necessarily expect that we will address the housing crisis in very short order. But the next thing I also heard too was a recognition that it will take a variety of stakeholders to address this issue, and I hope that we'll kind of move forward in our conversation in that light. So we are now going to switch gears and move into our moderated Q&A portion of the webinar. We do have a number of specific questions to ask the panelists, and we will also be taking questions from the participants. Those questions from the participants will be addressed near the end of our Q&A. And so participants, please remember to make sure that you're putting your questions into the Q&A and not the chat. You can upvote questions in the Q&A, and we'll try and get to as many as possible. So I'm just going to invite all of our panelists to come back on screen. I do have a number of specific questions, which will initially be targeted to one speaker, but of course you are welcome to participate as well. So Aidan, I am going to start off with you this morning, and I want you to just maybe sort of set the context for our discussion. So the provincial task force that we've already spoken about has released their recommendations, and the province has released their most recent housing supply action plan. So what do you think the province has got right in terms of how they're moving forward, and what do you think is missing in terms of the housing supply action plans?
Yeah, so as I alluded to a moment ago, I think they've started there's some work already done by some municipalities to start looking at making better use of the land that they already have. I think it's popularly called in Toronto the yellow belt running through the city, where it's basically we designed this community once 75 or 100 years ago, and we got it perfect that first time, so no one's allowed to change it. And I think that the city of Toronto, among others, was already looking at loosening that up a fair bit. And I think that is obviously a good first step, that the government went a bit further in Bill 23 at essentially reducing what there was left of some of the red tape, for lack of a better term, on intensifying in some of these areas. I think that though with the housing supply action plan that just came out on October 25th, I think we need to see it as like this government has just been reelected. It's love them or hate them. It is a huge majority that they got. Like, it's historic, the number of seats that they got, and under our system, that's power. And this is, I would say, their thesis as to what's wrong with the planning system. And again, you can agree with it or you can disagree with it. But if you take it and you look at it, you see that they believe that it has been years of buildup of regulations or of rules or policies or whatever we might call them, that have led to a supply crisis, essentially, that we're not building things fast enough. And so Bill 23, when looked at with some of their other policies, is really a way of them saying, we believe that government needs to get out of the way. The private sector can deliver these houses if we stop slowing them down. And what I think what they might have gotten right in Bill 23 is I think that it might be a little bit overshadowed by some of where I think they could have gone a bit further. I think that, for example, you know, as somebody who converted a single family house into 2 units, it takes a little bit more space when you put 2 households into a building. It would have been nice to see that was some of the most stressful experiences I had. It took a year to get 65 square feet added onto my house so I could have a bathroom on a floor. Like there's a lot of other things that could be done that could have gone a bit further in terms of some of that intensification. I expect we're going to see it still. I think we're going to see several announcements coming up in the new year that will focus on some of these sort of by right issues that planners frequently talk about. But I have to say, I think that there was an overemphasis on greenfield development in a lot of the moves that the government has made. I don't think that that is actually, if you just look at property values, people seem to want to live around other people near transit. And so I mean, if you're looking at the market for your answers, that the market seems to be speaking. I would have liked to see a little bit more emphasis on creating those livable communities in the lands that we already have. But I also think, again, taken with some of the other stuff like transit-oriented communities program, this government is really pouring as much fuel into the tank for new housing construction as possible.
Thank you. What do the other panelists think? Anyone want to jump in on this question?
It's a landmine you're asking me to jump in on. So I can't disagree with much of what Aidan said, with the one exception is the oversupply of the greenfield designated land. Now, I'm obviously biased. I come from a perspective that I'm a low-rise builder for the most part, not everything, but I do a lot of that work both in Ottawa and the GTA. And I think not that there's a land supply shortage. I don't ever believe there's a land supply shortage. What I believe is that we haven't focused on bringing those lands to be ready, shovel ready. Mm-hmm. And I think what's ended up happening is, I think we've done very well on intensification. I think the policies have worked out quite well, and it's buoyed by the number of starts and the number of cranes you see in Toronto. But what's missing there is, how does a family afford to live in concrete? And to describe it, 1,000 square foot condominium is probably worth about 1.4 or 1.5 million. And it's got a condominium fee of probably something in the order of $500 to $700 monthly. So it doesn't become conducive financially. I'm not saying people can't or shouldn't live in apartments, but what they end up doing is they look for affordable alternatives. And unfortunately, given the reality of the market, the affordable alternative happens to be usually 40, 50, 60 miles away from where sometimes their jobs are. And I think that's the disconnect, because we haven't been able to have these communities shovel ready, that there's abundance of call it direction towards intensification and less consideration of new homes in greenfield settings.
I knew you wouldn't shy away from controversy. Thanks, Gary. We'll move on to Michelle.
Thanks. So, I mean, I think I agreed actually with a lot of what Aidan said. I think, Gary, the reference to the greenfield, I think it's just there's complexities. I would say the city of Barrie has a lot of infill and a lot of greenfield. So I'm living and breathing both aspects of it. And there are complexities with both types of planning approvals. So the intensification, obviously coming into existing communities, there is a lot of neighborhood interest, and the infrastructure is a little bit old and crappy, to be honest. And then in the greenfield, no, there's no neighbors. It's a cakewalk in terms of our neighborhood meetings, but the infrastructure isn't there, and it doesn't happen quickly. And so it is about, and much like, I said at the beginning, greenfield or intensification, we need both of them. They're not going to, this whole target isn't going to happen. So I think, Bill 23 talking about, kind of the emphasis on the range of housing types, I think is super important. And I think the one element that that it's silent on, and it's a little bit of not really Doug Ford's problem, but it is planning director's problem, is that there hasn't been any sort of discussion on the integration, in particular in infill, into the existing communities, and that really is what that takes the time. And so, you know, it's not enough just to say, well, neighbors, there's a housing crisis, like it or lump it, we're stuffing more people in your community. You know, that stuff really certainly takes a lot of time. So I know it's probably not a popular opinion. You know, the initial versions of Bill 23 that talked about no third-party appeals, you know, people are up in the arms about that. But, you know, quite frankly, as a planning director, I haven't seen a true valid third-party appeal in a very, very long time. So when you talk about, and I mean by, you know, residents that hire consultants and actually put a case in and have planning merits. And so for me, yeah, I see a lot of those third-party appeals as delays for sure. And I know that, as I said, isn't necessarily a popular opinion, but it was certainly how I felt when I was hearing that. So yeah, I mean, as I said, I do think that you know, the legislation you know, certainly does have some good parts to it, and it's just like anything. It's good. There's going to be some people that look favorably on some parts of it, and a little bit less on the others.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And as I said, I'm always happy to hear controversial opinions. So I think that was helpful to put it out there. And we're going to actually move now to Michelle for this next question. And this is really from a planner's perspective, but given the fast pace at which changes are taking place around planning processes, how do planners plan with so much uncertainty right now?
Yeah, it's a little bit, and Angela kind of talked a bit about it in her opening statement, and the fact that it's literally such a changing environment. It's hard to keep up, and not only that, is it's hard to even you know, kind of like, okay, these are the rules, I can work in this, and then they change again. So, you know, as an example, we were doing a new official plan, and we started with 2041 forecast numbers in the growth plan. Kind of halfway through, we got 2051 numbers. There was no transition policies. There was nothing at the province that said, okay, Barry, you can continue on 2041. You can do an OPA to get to 2051. So I've lived it. I've lived and breathed it myself. But, you know, change isn't really new to planners as a profession. You know, we support change in people's communities all the time with our recommendations to consider planning approvals. And so I think regardless of whether you're a registered professional planner or an engineer or whatever your role is in community building, I think we all just have to focus on what we do and what our role is in that community building. And, you know, pace is for sure something that's impacting us all. But I think, you know, similar to what Gary said, some stuff has taken a long, long time. And so, while it might seem like the pace is like crazy fast, it probably isn't. It probably just is a little bit more aggressive, or, you know, the expression I say to my team is a little bit more, we got to look alive, like we got to move, like we got to be. So I don't actually think that the pace is crazy fast. I just think it's faster than we've become accustomed to working in. And, you know, there have been certainly tons and tons of things. The build report by Altus, and the one thing that really resonated with me with that report was the fact that it said small, easy projects, like little tiny projects, didn't actually move any faster than like 1,000 lot subdivisions. And for me, that was something that really resonated with me in terms of, you know, honestly, what are we doing? Like, why that should not be the case. Like, you should not be able to be approving 1,000 lot subdivisions faster than 6 units. So I think it's just a matter of, you know, maybe just having a bit of self-reflection, saying it's really not moving as fast as you might think. It's just faster than we've gotten used to. Really focusing on what our tasks are and our role in community building. And then just understanding that philosophically and fundamentally, we actually want the same thing. We want the houses built. And as a municipal planning director, we want people living in the units and going to our parks and working in our businesses. And so, you know, we really want the same thing. So if you can kind of maybe dissect some of those pieces to it and just use it as momentum and moving forward, I think that's kind of how I certainly talk to my team, and certainly how I've been approaching all these legislative changes.
That's great. I think that would be very helpful for your team, I'm sure, in terms of change management. What about the other panelists? How are you feeling in terms of the potential fast pace of changes in the planning system right now?
I can weigh into that. I think if nothing else, planners have to be flexible during this time. I think it's important that we, like to what Michelle was saying, we have to take responsibility for the files that we manage. We have to actively manage them. The fact that large subdivisions are taking a shorter amount of time than some of the smaller developments, and we see that in our area as well, particularly with infill development, because there's a lot of issues with it. Like, that really shouldn't be the case. So I think we have to be very careful about what we're asking for in terms of studies, and we need to manage the risk of a development and how we're commenting on it from our particular interests. Like, we shouldn't be asking for things just because we can. And I think we need to take a step back once in a while and really understand what the issues are, what the risks are, and understand the development and take responsibility for managing the file.
Thanks, Glenn. We'll go to Angela now.
Yeah, I think especially in this time, as in all times, to do planning effectively, I think relationships are everything, right? So the interaction between all of the people involved in community building, it's essential that those communications and those lines of communication stay open. And I think particularly right now, as we're dealing with some approaches that feel like, and I would say that, as a follow-up to question number one, some approaches that feel like some of this seems like a one-size-fits-all in terms of whenever you have something, someone says, well, in this area, this might be broken, so we're going to do sweeping changes across the board. I think we have to remain, number one, open and ready to have the discussions with our partners to keep those relationships going. And number two, realizing that one size fits all isn't necessarily, and doing a sweeping change every time an issue is identified creates more chaos and disorder to the system. So we have to figure out ways to work within that. And I think third, Gary touched about it in terms of labor shortages for the actual physical building of the homes. There's also a technical and professional data gap or data shortage. And as important it is that we have the people to build those homes, it's equally important that we have the right staff in place to make sure that the early side of development approvals goes well. So those are my thoughts on some of those things that I see as really important right now. And all those things lead to instability. So the reverse of those lead to stability. So we want to have stability and predictability. And by doing that, we need good communication, good workers available, and clear processes within which to work. So those are my submissions.
Great. Thanks, Angela. And we'll go to Aidan now.
Yeah, so I work mostly, some of my clients are private sector developers and some of them are municipalities themselves. And so I get to see planners on both sides. I get to work closely with planners on both sides as they digest all these changes. And I think, it's a testament to the profession that they are almost stoic in how they respond to these changes as they come down, and they look at them, and whether it's a project on a single site or whether it's looking at how a change applies to an entire official plan. I see most planners, basically every planner I'm working with right now, just gets to it, looks at it. How does this impact what I'm working on? I find more often, and perhaps this is just the position I'm in, I see them sort of start from the thing that they're already working on and looking at how how it ink blots out from there, and then they can see a bit more of the systemic side of it. I think there is a risk, though, that this change, that there's a bit of a pendulum effect happening right now. I think that that's a real risk that this government is running. And I think we saw it already start towards the end of the previous government, where there was a sense across the sector that one side was winning out too much on the great debates of the day. I was working at the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, and it was really exciting time to be an environmentalist working there. We were really, it seemed like we were expanding a lot of the the protections compared to what had existed before. But we were hearing from the sector that it was unbalanced. We had heard from municipal officials that they were worried about their ability to implement some of these policies that we had come up with. And they were saying it out loud. This wasn't secrets. This was getting passed in council resolutions and, on shows like The Agenda. And I think that we're actually approaching the other side of that now. I think that there is a pendulum effect. I think it's real. And I think that we are at a point now where there's going to be appetite for another correction. And I worry for my friends and colleagues who are like that detailed planner, working at a municipality, working for a planning firm. It's exhausting. Like you're doing the work more than once often because you're trying to incorporate other things. And I have a lot of patience, particularly for municipal planners. I wouldn't want that job. And in part it is because sorry, but I think people need to be empathetic to what's going on for municipal planning departments with all of these changes constantly washing through. And I advise my clients that all the time. It's like, yeah, it might take a bit longer, but why don't we remember it's a human on the other side of the counter, and they've got lots of other pressures. And I think that these changes are actually part of what's driving planners out of municipal service roles, frankly. Making the problem a bit worse. It's not just the content of the changes, which some of them may philosophically disagree with. I think it's the scope, the scale, and the speed, and then the sort of doing and undoing of policies that is really unfortunate certainly for friends of mine who work in the municipal sector. It's exhausting, and so I don't worry about their professionalism. I am starting to worry a bit about their stamina.
All right. Well, I think a lot of people probably appreciate those supportive comments, Aidan. We have talked a little bit about greenfield development and the question of allocating resources. And so my next question I'm going to direct towards Gary. And I want to hear, in your opinion, what is the efficient use of land? And how would using land more efficiently contribute to better planning outcomes?
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. And I was thinking about this relative to the MCRs that have just been completed across the province, and call it. And in many of those municipalities, there's been an amount of land that's been added to the urban boundaries. And as most people on this call know, that's the precursor for a lot of sub-watershed work to be started. A lot of secondary plan, tertiary plan, depending on where you are in terms of geography, the lingo. And these large scale planning exercises, I've been involved in many of them throughout the GTA over the last 20 years. And I guess I come away with this opinion that generally we collectively as stakeholders, because I don't want to put this on anyone's shoulders, we don't look at land as a finite resource when we're planning these communities. And that sounds kind of controversial, but hear me out. Generally speaking, you're provided a population allotment, then you have a defined geography. We have a unit mix, a targeted density threshold, and then you prepare what I call, and most planners on this call would call, a land budget. And the land budget can be kind of described in two buckets. And I'm a simple guy, so it's simple for me to say it. It's either developable land or non-developable or complementary. So when you look at, on average, and this is based on my experience, and it may vary by location, that around 40% of the land after these exercises are completed are developable. And the remaining lands are set aside for a required use, whether it's a park, a school, storm ponds, natural heritage systems, and or roads, of course. So just general math, you have a 1,000-acre concession block, about 400 acres is set aside to actually accommodate homes and jobs for people, and the remainder is set aside for some other use. So during those exercises leading up to the preparation of a secondary plan, there's a lot of areas that become gray. There's features on those lands that are completely definable. We set limits and we know what they are. And whether it's a significant woodland or a wetland or a provincially significant wetland, like we're able to define those. And then there's a lot of stuff that falls in the middle, this gray area that I mean, again, I'm a simple guy. I call them the puddles or the intermittent streams or the hedgerows and the specimen trees, that kind of stuff. And that becomes, in my mind, the negotiation. Oh, and of course, buffers to all these features with, that are identified as preservation. So as we move through these exercises, all that my observation is, I think we obviously need to protect what's important, and we need to connect what's important through natural heritage system green infrastructure. I'm not even debating the point. What I'm suggesting is when we get into the exercises, so if we have buffers, in my experience, buffers have always been sacrosanct. First of all, bigger is always better. And the ability to encroach into those lands with any complementary land use. I'm saying if I had a low impact development standard feature, I would like the opportunity, or a storm pond, or the opportunity to utilize the buffer, provided I can show no negative impact. I think these kinds of complementary uses help deliver the housing side of it, whereas density always isn't the right answer. I know, well, on 400 acres, you just go up and you'll just accommodate more people. Well, it doesn't always work that way. And for most greenfield scenarios, there has to be a market component. So you need more grade-related housing, in my opinion, in certain locations. Being a little bit more progressive with our stormwater management ponds and combining it with other use, i.e. parkland, or allowing them to be combined. And I know that that has occurred in some geographies, which I think is a great step forward. And then probably one of the more controversial parts of Bill 23 is one of compensation or offsetting. To me, these little puddles get identified very early in the planning exercise. And generally speaking, there was the concept of complexing, and then protection, and then buffering. And if we have the ability to offset and put these features and replace and enhance these features to create the system, to me, that's the ability, because it's a win-win. I believe we're enhancing the environment, protecting what's important, but we're also then able to develop a complete community, because to the industry, the asset that's most important to us is the real estate. And I think there also needs to be an attitudinal change in our school boards. And I'm kind of rambling between environment, but the school boards come at it, we're creating these complete compact communities, but the school sizes still have to be, I'll call it, the Aaron Mills of the world, the old suburban standard of 6 or 8 acres. Why is it if I have to, we are developing communities at higher densities, that our school sites can't be significantly smaller, i.e. City of Toronto size, 3 acres, 4 acres, building elementary schools up 3-4 stories. So these are the kinds of things that I hope as we move through all these MCRs leading to the secondary plan, that we can have this dialogue on how we look at this finite resource differently than we have historically. And I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I'm not saying that we should be, just being flippant with what environmental features are worthy of preservation. Quite the opposite. I'm just trying to find that balance, as has been used by so many of the panelists, to create housing and a sustainable, robust, environmental, sustainable community.
Thanks, Gary. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, and that's great. And I know that that specific question, and I think what I like about the concept of infill, the concept and the reality really is that there aren't those pressures necessarily on the environmental features as there is with greenfield development. And schools are actually a great example where I even say to school boards when they come to me, I'm like, can't you do can't you, like, literally, can you not do a 3-story school? Do you need to have this 2-story footprint? And, you know, the school boards are not unlike any other public agency. This is the plan we do, and this is the size we need. And, but, you know, I think schools, community centers, libraries, there's lots of opportunity to put some extra housing on a lot of those sites. Parking lots are kind of my big bugaboo, you know, where, you know, we don't necessarily need the parking ratios of the 70s and 80s. That certainly is the City of Barrie zoning bylaw. So we don't need that. And again, that's land that's already developed. So, you know, I think that's, you know, we do need to look, and it's not just we're focusing about residential, but it's exactly the same for commercial. It's exactly the same for industrial. Kind of the footprints of the 60s, 70s, and 80s aren't necessarily the footprints we need for any of those uses in 2022 and beyond. So I think that's, you know, kind of that looking from within piece is going to be super important for all land uses. And then it is a little bit about the best of both worlds. It gets you that additional capacity without the impacts on the natural heritage system and the environment in the same way that greenfield development does.
Thanks, Michelle. We'll go to Aidan now.
There we go. I just want to echo some of what Gary was saying around like looking at better ways of co-locating different community assets. I think one of the things that Bill 23 did that I think is incredibly helpful in an intensification context is, for those who don't know, it was not every municipality would accept parkland if it had a pipe running underneath it, for example. And so Bill 23 changes that, makes that an acceptable, I think, I don't want to misspeak, but I think municipalities have to accept it if that's part of the parkland plan or something along those lines. It was, I've worked on a few sites where units are lost, buildings are significantly altered because of municipalities being unwilling to accept that. And I get why. Like, I'm sympathetic. You know, you have to dig up the park, you know, once every 15 years, or if something goes wrong, more frequently than that. But it's, you know, we have a real problem with building affordable housing in areas that can provide affordable lifestyles. And I think that this is one way of just easing it up a little bit. There's a couple of projects I've worked on where, like I said, it really has a consequence on the number of units that can be delivered. And I think that the government, that was one thing that they got right in that bill, was to sort of encourage co-locating community assets, whether it's an underground pipe in a park. But you'll also notice that a lot of the there is a more of a conversation happening around educational facilities, generally speaking, where, you know, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, it was all about who's going to get the next campus. And like, that was the exciting things, these very land intense educational facilities. The province and also some municipalities have now come out saying that we want to look at how to use the school land better. And some cities have for a long time had a sort of a double dedication of school property being parkland, because that's essentially what it becomes when school is out. But we're also looking at, you know, some of these older schools in very dense communities and historic communities around Ontario are reaching the end of their natural lifespan, and those school boards should be encouraged at looking at how to reorganize their land in such a way that may provide, you know, additional housing, particularly housing, family-oriented housing near the school. And so I do have a project on the go where we are looking at exactly that. And the regulatory environment is not too friendly, I have to say. Like, it's several layers of governments going back to, I think, the Harris government. Have put on rules around opening and closing schools and how to do capital repairs. But there is a real willingness on just about every political audience across all the three main political stripes looking at how we can do a better job of reorganizing school sites and integrating them more into modern communities. So I think, most people on this call, I think, probably know that, a neighborhood ages very quickly and very suddenly. And so using land efficiently to make sure that you're always having a supply of families using a school, I think is important. And I would just throw one last little idea out there. Something I've been talking about with one of my clients is the idea that single family detached housing, maybe there should be a time limit on how long a community maintains that designation. Maybe it shouldn't last longer than 30 years or 25 years. And it sort of naturally, as the community reaches an old and somewhat depopulated state, it comes up for some new thinking and some new development.
Okay, thanks for throwing that one out there, Aidan. We'll go to Glen for the last word on this topic, and then we'll move on from there.
Okay, I'll try to keep it short. I think a lot of what we're talking about here, particularly on the environmental side of the equation, is kind of like a master planning exercise. And I think really, we need to kind of restore the commitment to undertaking master planning, because that informs, secondary plans and community design plans and everything that kind of falls out of that. And, you're identifying or characterizing constraints and opportunities for development, and servicing options are identified, kind of proof of concept solutions for water, wastewater, transportation, stormwater. So I think if all parties are doing their job at the master planning stage, there shouldn't be any kind of last minute requests or I guess obstacles to that would otherwise delay development approval. Our approach has been to, where we have approved master plans in place, master drainage plans, whatever, that we've endorsed as a conservation authority, we generally withdraw from the site-specific review of a stormwater management plan, and we're relying on the municipality to make sure that the stormwater design plans and whatever are in accordance with the master drainage plan. And that's an efficiency we tried to bring to the process. So yeah, I just wanted to put that out there. I just think we need to restore our commitment to that kind of an approach.
All right, well, thanks, Glen. And you kind of helped segue into the next topic, which is around the role of conservation authorities. So we're going to turn to Angela for this question. Conservation authorities are integrated into the reviews and approval process, as Glen has already indicated. But what steps can conservation authorities take to assist with housing and the affordability crisis overall?
Okay, thanks, Leslie, for the question. And I do have some thoughts and ideas, and that's what I reserve my comment on the last sort of discussion we were having, hopefully with lots of ways to transition it into this particular piece. So I think I really thought there was a lot of great things that Gary said in his presentation. And, it sounds like, certain files you would receive what seems to be like a very good quality submission in terms of what is presented at first instance. And I think that is the ideal for everybody, right? So people have had forward thought and consideration of whatever is on site from a number of perspectives, whether it be the marketability of the homes at the end of the day, to the ecological functioning of the site or other concerns thereon. So I think that, when you have a quality submission with a quality development proposal, you have the opportunity there for good outcomes. And I think that's essential. I do think, however, we should mention that not all submissions are necessarily a quality type submission, and that's the area where, I think improvements could be made and things could go faster. I hope that could could be the case. You know, we have over 500 people online today, so you're always mindful about what you say and how you say it, and you're trying to imagine all of the people that are listening. So forever who's offended, well, in advance, I apologize. These are simply, you know, what I'm thinking. So, you know, the other side of a submission where you don't have a quality submission is a very challenging type of file indeed. So sometimes what you'll have is everything that was what would have been considered worthy of some kind of a consideration is removed from the site before you go in to actually do any type of approval and whatnot. So that can be a really challenging situation for everybody to deal with and move forward with. I guess the other question too, you know, in terms of where I know from my many years in development review, was the question about what's the quality of the site for development. So we over the years have seen a degradation sometimes in terms of what we're dealing with from the developability of a site. So whether it's, you know, unstable kind of subsoils, I'm talking about a sort of an Ottawa specific type of approach, you know, liquefiable clays, karst topography, and a lot of site condition challenges that to deal with. I think those provide unique challenges. Again, to Glen's point, really important to understand those before everybody gets started. So unnecessary studies or studies that are thought of as unnecessary or at least unknown studies don't come on. But I think the quality of the development site is important for a number of things, particularly where you've got rural development and you don't have services going to site. You know, I've seen municipalities with huge issues, water quality, contamination issues, inadequate water quality as time goes on. So we're all about trying to help figure out the challenges on the site and where things can go wrong. So I think sometimes we're left with these really challenging issues, and conservation authorities, you know, were created to figure out some of the more challenging issues. And so sometimes I think that that's where we run into blockades is you're created for a reason to deal with the challenging issues. So everyone would like to say every time that the CA is involved on a file, it seems to be a challenging issue. So the answer is thus to get rid of the perceived barrier, which is, you know, the CA that is involved on the site. I do think dispute resolution mechanisms are important. So where you get into things that are dragging on and a battle of experts does sort of start to ensue sometimes, that adequate dispute resolution methods are there. I know that's touched on sometimes in the discussion around Bill 23. I just personally support that as a way that, you know, there's some ways to go. And I think, you know, ultimately though, at the end of the day, leaving aside, you know, some of the other things we were discussing, the work I've done, you know, leads me to think, you know, sometimes for conservation authorities, where we're going with this, and I said in particular with the Canadian discussion, most people aren't saying conservation authorities are doing a bad job protecting some of these things. What they're saying is the process is too long and it's too expensive. But we do have to remember at the end of the day, we are going to be dealing with the decisions we take today in the 20-year and 30-year planning horizon, and often sooner, I will say often sooner, is going to lead the municipalities and others to what are effectively uninsurable losses. So keep in mind that uninsurable losses at the end of the day are what's at stake if we simply really open up these files. And I think, you know, every time we would have a new council turnover, we would have this pressure to allow a whole bunch of new infill and development, for example, behind water control features, dams, dikes, berms, etc. Keep in mind the structures are built to a certain design standard, often the 1:100 or less. And when you start putting a lot of development behind those with planning departments and climate change and everything else, is our infrastructure even really built to protect that development, particularly in a development regime where in the future we will be dealing with uninsurable losses. So that means that the person, whether it's a business or an individual, won't have commercially probably available home insurance or others to cover off those losses. So that is a lot to unpack, but the CA work, it really matters that we have quality submissions to review, a dispute resolution process if we run into a problem, and at the end of the day, keeping in mind that some of the issues CAs are asked to deal with are some of those more consequential ones that will be expensive in the future if we get them wrong. That's it for me on this one.
Anyone else on the panel have something to add? Go ahead, Aidan.
I think, you know, I think one of the challenges, it's not just with conservation authorities, but we do, it can feel very opaque. And part of this, again, is workload. We're in a very busy construction environment, a very busy planning environment, you know, and as much as I hate the expression, it's actually quite true. Time is money. And I think, you know, different conservation authorities are integrated at a different level than others. I don't think anyone on this panel, certainly, and anyone on this webinar would be surprised to hear that. And I think one of the things that I've found frustrating, both working for municipalities on looking at their development approvals processes and working with developers trying to get something done, is how difficult it can be to find a precise where your application is in the system, what is going on with it in the system, when will I hear back about it, is there someone I can talk to about it? And it's really, I think what has happened with that is that I think conservation authorities have maybe been, you know, blamed at times for things that are not actually within their control, or whereas you know, or sometimes it's a conservation authority like a municipality or like a developer maybe is understaffed, and it can be really hard. Like I always encourage, you know, empathy as much as possible in all of my dealings with either with developers or with municipalities, and it can be really hard when there's this dearth of information getting across from where an application, which is like, you know, maybe someone's entire livelihood is riding on it, is getting to like that line of communication is missing often, and it's not any ill will, it's just circumstances often, and I think that's caused some of the problem, and it's certainly caused some of the political headache that I think conservation authorities have. I triggered some hands up. I'm nervous.
I was going to say, yeah, you've got a hot one going now here. We'll go to Michelle.
I actually forgot that I was supposed to respond when Aidan said that how bad of a job municipal planning is. I was laughing quietly, and I said I should have said that before. I have a lot of teachers in my family, and so for me, that's what I always say to them. I'm like, I wouldn't want to be a teacher for love or money, and so it's funny that some people look at my job that way. Just a couple things. So, you know, in the city of Barrie in particular, we're a split community in the sense that we deal with the Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority, and we also deal with the NVCA. And I have yet in my dealings here had basically a conservation authority not work with an applicant ever. Like, and you know, whether you're a 30 meter buffer, 10 meter, like I've never had a scenario where either conservation authority isn't willing to work with the party. The issue is, and this is what people have said, is the length of time it takes to get to that, right? So I had someone ask me something, and it wasn't a conservation authority thing, but they said, you know, they were asking us to look at changing a standard, and they want a decision right away, and they want to move forward right away. And I said, if you want to move forward right away, just meet our standard. Like, as soon as you make me not meet my standard, I have to kind of make sure it's documented and say why it is. And I also see that Angela's conversation about bad submissions has lit up the chat line. And what I think is interesting is it comes back to kind of what I was talking about in terms of being a planner. We all have our roles to play in community building. And as a municipal, effectively, I'm a reviewer, a conservation authorities review materials. So our role isn't producing good products. And so it's easy for us to say, and we say it ourselves, that submissions are crappy. So, you know, crap in, crap out kind of thing. But at the end of the day, that's not our role in community building, because we're not producing those documents. But what our role is that reviewing. And so I think, you know, with that, the element of triage, like, and it takes time, and it's, you know, it is a bit of I've got to report in, I have to drop everything, take a look at it, and like in a day or two say, nope, that's a crappy submission. What I think people get frustrated with is that it takes 6 weeks to hear that it's a crappy submission, or it takes longer to hear, oh, you've completely missed this whole, you know, reference. So I think in terms of what our role is, you know, I think certainly the role that I have is and how to address the, you know, the bad submissions at the start, you know, making sure your terms of reference are as close to perfect as possible, making sure if they need to be scoped, that would be great. Having kind of those ground rules knowing going forward, and then just being able to quickly triage the submission that you get. And as I said, give that, you know, give that no or that, quality QA/QC as quickly as possible, because as I said, it is, I think that's often what some of it is as well. And again, in our role is like, we're not going to go and say, okay, I'm hopping over the counter and I'm going to make a great submission. It doesn't work that way. So just a reminder to all of us. But if you are a consultant, give us good stuff. and if you are asked to do something that you don't understand, or you're asked to do something that you think is stupid, then have a call someone and say, hey, Michelle, do you really need to do this? Or can I do it this way? Or can I do it at site plan? Don't just kind of go blindly. If there is something that doesn't seem right to you, then just ask, and ask kind of, again, don't wait 6 weeks to ask me in 6 days. So, and as I said, I can't really talk about, I wouldn't want to be a teacher. I wouldn't want to work at a conservation authority. You just take the role that you have and just do it to the absolute best of your ability. And I think all of us in the process and the outcomes will be better.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. So we'll go to Gary. We all three, Gary, Angela, and Glenn, want to talk on this point as well. Just want to keep your comments short, because we do have one last question we want to get to, which I think probably ties very closely into what we're already talking about. So go ahead, Gary.
Couldn't agree more with Angela. Like, a bad submission isn't helpful to anyone. So from my perspective, on the proponent side, if we can't make a hurdle to create a submission that answers the questions that have been necessarily put to us, terms of reference that have been reviewed, pre-con, then we're just not doing our job. And I don't think that's fair for anyone on our side of the table to say it's the conservation authority that's not doing theirs. I would defend conservation authorities to the end on that one point. I think, and again, I'll be very brief, one of the challenges for everyone involved in this part of the development industry is the conflict between policy. And, you have the federal species at risk, you have the provincial policy statement, places to grow plan, regional official plan policy, local official plan policy, conservation authority, small p policy, big P policy guidelines. I don't know how anyone sitting in a conservation authority can actually understand how to actually assess each of these policies and then weigh what's more important than the other. I sympathize that it's such a challenge for everyone involved. So I just think we've got a systemic policy problem in that it's too complicated and too overlapping, and no one quite comprehends or understands how it all fits.
Go ahead, Angela.
Was going to take that hand down at the same time. Maybe I'll go down. Okay, perfect. No, just, quickly too, I think that, to the point Michelle and others were making too, I have worked on the billable hour before as well. I am sympathetic to, you can't have necessarily perfect submissions because there's a cost to that. And so you have to be streamlined. So again, I think the checklists, the understanding, and then ultimately as well, the sort of dispute resolution process, if things do get bottlenecked at a certain point, I think is important. The other thing I wanted to say just really quick is, where I worked before as a general manager of a conservation authority before coming to Conservation Ontario, we experienced both the 2017 and the 2019 floods. And that was ultimately, at the end of the day, we had what was called no man's land along the Ottawa River, where there was no conservation authority taking jurisdiction. And we had one of the last jurisdiction expansions to actually happen recently in 2020, where we have a whole municipality asking today to join a conservation authority. And what made them do it? What made them do it was they'd approved a bunch of development in the floodplain because of a number of things, right? Because of inexperienced staff, because of political pressure, because of a number of things, lack of understanding. And so ultimately, where the Conservation Authority, I think, will continue to have value. And I think it really is about understanding that, if you move things too much, we find out why they're created. And so that's sort of just a little additional perspective of my recent experience. And we were certainly able to sell the value of a conservation authority today And that was like, 2020, the last big jurisdiction expansions where a municipality has to take of their hard-earned levy, pay a conservation authority to come in, help with the development review process, help understand, Gary, the plethora of competing obligations. And I think that that's why this is a very modern piece, and keeping in mind that the work of the CA was at one time, some provincial responsibility. So where we don't have, for example, provincial planners coming in to take up that responsibility, the CAs are filling that role. That role won't go away, I don't think. And like I said, I've seen it firsthand. Municipalities saying there's value in this, we're willing to pay for it in the modern day context. So that's it for me on that one. I just wanted to, I forgot to mention that and I had it in my notes. So
Thanks, Angela. Okay, Glen, quickly to you.
Okay, I'd just like to quickly make the argument here for, I guess what I would call a kind of a consistent terms of reference for and criteria for technical studies that can be tweaked for local conditions. I mean, we're all typically asking for the same types of reports, be it stormwater management or an EIS for whatever. But it seems that we're always having to discuss terms of reference for these studies, and these discussions often get bogged down. I would say kind of the most significant challenge we have to moving applications forward in a timely manner is that we have technical studies that are prepared in the absence of a terms of reference or any kind of agreed upon scope, and then we receive studies that contain either insufficient information or irrelevant information, and that is it really bogs down the reviews, because then you have to have that discussion and you have to have various iterations of reports. Like sometimes we have 4 iterations of a stormwater management report. Well, that's ridiculous. Like why is that happening? And that just consumes a lot of resources that nobody has. So that's my plug for consistent terms of reference.
Thank you. I'm sure that would go a long way in simplifying some of these development reviews and submissions. So Glen, we're going to let you have the final question. And as I said, we have sort of started talking about it a little bit already, but in Ontario, we have numerous parties involved in the land use planning process. How can we better align the various approval agencies and improve how they are working together?
Well, in anticipation of this question, I made a bit of a list. So I first wanted to talk about the impediment. So I think, the policy of various agencies and municipalities, conservation authorities, if the policies are not aligned or they're inconsistent, for example, we might have an official plan policy that it will allow for consideration of development that is not consistent with, say, the CA's policies, or poorly written policies that are subject to various interpretations. Timelines that don't permit adequate time for discussion and coordination of comments. Lack of pre-consultation is huge. Reluctance to follow the technical guidance that we're all supposed to be using to implement the various aspects of the PPS. So I think we need, for better alignment, we need clear and well-defined policies that are not in conflict. We need pre-consultation at which all parties are present. Terms of reference and checklists for technical studies. We need to establish consistent review timelines, ensure applications are complete. One of the things we've done, and I'm sure other conservation authorities and municipalities have done it, we participate on development review teams that sit down and review applications, probably starting with pre-consultation, so that we're making sure that everybody's on the same page. And be open to communication, minimize the emails, pick up the phone. Like I think our communications over the last little while have become very impersonal. And I think we need to build relationships with our municipal partners and our developers and our consultants. And it's really hard to do that with multiple email exchanges on a file. Just pick up the phone and have those conversations.
Great. Does anyone want to have the last word before we go on to questions from the audience?
I just couldn't agree more about pre-consultation. Having a really good way of getting all of the what would be required for, you know, as Michelle puts it, a good application, so it's not garbage in, garbage out. I think making those more robust and mandatory part of the process, like universally, would probably help a lot.
Okay, Michelle, you want to sneak one last comment in there? Go ahead.
Yeah, just about, obviously, with Bill 109 and the concept of, you know, speedy applications within a prescribed timeline, or, you know, the ability or the requirement to refund fees, you know, that early upfront robust consultation is the only way. It's the only way I see that we're going to be able to in any way move forward. Just because I know that so much of the time that it takes to go from, you know, the first iteration to a recommendation for approval, so much of that really is the back and forth, and that does take time, and I don't actually know a way to speed that up without us all kind of at least starting the game at the same time in the same place, and hopefully, as I said, all of us kind of keeping our eye on the prize and honing our role and making sure that we're doing our role as best as we possibly can.
That's great. Well, thanks to all the panelists for entertaining my questions. Now we are going to move into questions from the audience, and I want to say a big thank you to the audience. As Michelle commented on, the webinar chat is on fire. Everybody's wanting to respond to what the panelists are saying. That's wonderful, and we have a ton of questions from the audience. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to them all, but we will do our best to get to some of them. So we're going to start off with a question about subwatershed studies. And so the question is that subwatershed studies are a fundamental and proven approach to balancing development in the environment. They are comprehensive and collaborative, hence tend to take time and money. So how do you see the recent changes affecting subwatershed studies and the role they play in balancing the environment with development interests?
I suppose you want someone to go, eh, Leslie?
I was surprised. We talked about this at a planning
so-
meeting, and everybody couldn't help but talk about their love of subwatershed studies.
Yeah, I mean, I think subwatershed studies, you know, again, the idea that one size fits all, you know, it is a bit problematic. Some sites and some areas you're going to have the resources and etc. resources of many kinds to make sure that that is done well in advance. And those are important studies. I don't see that vastly changing on the go forward. I do think that that work will continue. It's important priority work. And as I've said on a number of these issues, just because, you know, just because an issue may change in legislation doesn't mean that the politicization of that issue is going to change, whether it's for the developer, the local council, etc. We are not at a time when environmental issues are not at the top of mind of our communities. We have a very savvy bunch of community-minded people who want to live in communities that are well thought out and have those attributes that they're looking for. That is an interest that should be common to you, whether you're trying to sell a home or to plan for those communities. So I think it's a common interest. At the end of the day, we got to think about that. We know that people want to live in good communities. And good communities are all about something that's functioning well for those communities. That's my take.
Great, thanks, Angela. Go ahead, Gary.
Sorry, yeah, I believe subwatershed studies will continue to be an important part of the planning process, particularly, as I said earlier, in dealing with these new areas that are being added to urban boundaries. I think that what we should do, and one of the positions I've always advocated, is that once lands are added to an urban boundary, that's the day in which a sub-watershed study should commence, because it becomes the precursor to a lot of the other thresholds, whether it be water, the environment, where you can and can't develop. So to me, it becomes really important to start it early, end it as quickly as possible. And once it's established, it sets the parameters. And I think Glenn mentioned it earlier, that it sets the parameters for most studies to follow. So it actually makes you go faster at the back end if you do the work earlier at the front end. So I couldn't agree more that they will continue to be an important part of the planning system.
Thanks. Go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, like, I certainly don't see anything in Bill kind of 23 that would diminish the value of undertaking watershed, sub-watershed planning. If anything, it maybe puts an emphasis on the need for it as a valuable tool for making sure we can do planning and move development through the approvals process in a more timely manner. I think where there are some limitations to watershed, sub-watershed planning are in some of our rural municipalities that maybe don't have the resources to do that, and I really see that is a role for conservation authorities to help our municipalities in that area where they just don't have the resources to do it. And as conservation authorities, we do have a lot of information in our watersheds because we have very robust monitoring programs, and I think that's something that we need to or could do in the future.
Great. So the next question I want to pose to the group is around where we're building in Ontario. So the question is, do we really want to shoehorn more people into the GTA? Where's the conversation around how we can shift economic development away from Southern Ontario and provide jobs and affordable housing in places like North Bay, Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie, and Thunder Bay?
I mean, I can take a quick run at that. I agree. So as I mentioned in my bio, I had a whole bunch of other policy jobs before. One of them was at the Provincial Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration. And, one of the things that we focus on there is settlement services. And in Canada, we have the right to free movement. You can't say, no, Toronto's full up at 3.9 million or whatever we are now here, or Guelph can't grow past at this point. And unfortunately, it means that if we decide that we don't want more people in our cities, then our cities will just stop producing housing, and that housing will continue to get more expensive, and on and on and on and on. I sympathize with the idea that we need to find better ways of distributing more of our population across the country, because there's a lot of benefits to population growth as well. Canada depends on it. But I don't think that simply directing new Canadians to places that the existing population has chosen not to live in is a reasonable or feasible solution.
Go ahead, Angela.
Yeah, I don't, want to give a totally invisible hand kind of answer to this, but I do think that the market it kind of does dictate some of this, and I'm sure, so I'm trying to, there we're lowered. I'm sure, Michelle, you see this, right? Like the market pushes certain people to different places. That still does a couple of things though, right? So number one, the jury's still out on the ramifications of a post-COVID work economy and how that actually pushes migration patterns and the preferences of people in terms of where they locate and what's required of them in terms of their jobs. We do know, like the research suggests certainly that, it's here to stay, or certainly a hybrid model is here to stay. So how will that push things? And I do think we've seen in a post-pandemic, or at least during that sort of very near post-pandemic boom, you have seen migration away from certain provinces towards other provinces, right? Where housing, et cetera, may be cheaper. You also see it in the population, or specifically the demographic shift of population in terms of where retirees depending on the resources they have available to them and the types of services they may require, healthcare, et cetera, where they're going to choose to position themselves. So I think some of that is market driven. I think some of that is a post-pandemic COVID type of wait and see on where workers are going to work, live, and raise their families. We do know always, though, there's going to be a few things driving that. Affordability, along with access to those programs, services that people look for in their communities, including healthcare, schools, places to work, and what makes a place great to raise a family. So, well, I think jury's out on some of it. Gary probably knows more than I do, though. I'd like to, yeah, he knows where they're holding land. You could ask him, I suppose.
Well, you know what? Maybe we don't need to put Gary too much on the hot seat on that one, but we'll keep going though. There's still lots of some questions in here. So the next question I'm hoping to tackle is, are there any thoughts about the affordability part of the picture? So increasing housing supply does not help first-time buyers or renters if it's still priced out of reach. So if you guys could just make some general comments about affordability. Go ahead.
I'll kick it off. I'm also on the board of a not-for-profit housing corporation that focuses on affordable ownership. So there are models out there that help first-time buyers or families that maybe they're not first-time, but they're having trouble making that first step to home ownership, normally because they don't have enough for a down payment. There are programs out there, and I think that they're really important. One of the things that I think we need to keep an eye on when it comes to affordability is that it's going to cost money. Like we pay taxes. Our taxes should go towards making sure that people don't lack a roof over their head or an adequate form of housing for their family simply because they've fallen on hard times or something like that. And so but the same is, there's also, when we're talking about more market-driven affordable, it requires some, in this environment, I do think it requires some help, not necessarily just from governments, but some creativity. So just as an example, the organization that I'm with, Trillium Not-for-Profit, we support families getting into the home ownership market by providing mortgage support, so second mortgages that sort of allow a family to transition from a rental situation to a home ownership situation while paying roughly the same amount in monthly expenses. And as the home value increases, the not-for-profit organization gets a benefit of that increased value, but the homeowner also gets the benefit. So I think that there's different creative ways of getting at it. I don't think a strictly hands-off market approach is going to deliver it, in part because I honestly don't think we can build that many houses that quickly to have a significant impact on affordability in the time scale that we want to see it.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, I think the affordability piece is definitely something that none of us are going to have any sort of clarity on. I was at a seminar at the end of June, and it was with more financial people and mortgage brokers, and what they had said is that economists, for the most part, predict the future, I guess, if you will, on past trends, which is not unlike a lot of professionals, but they said, but we have not ever, in the 100 years, we've never come out of a pandemic with, record low interest rates, with, people needing to stretch their legs more now than ever before. And it's almost a bit like the perfect storm of, kind of how we got here. And, CMHC at that point, was saying, definitely, it's a supply and demand. And as soon as the supply is there, the demand is going to temper and the prices will come down. And I actually just don't think it's that easy. Like, I just don't think it's going to be that meaningful because the prices have just been, combined with the low interest rates have just been so inflated to make up for things like, you know, the material shortage and the labor shortage and the competition for the same labor pools and all those sorts of things. So, I mean, I think the affordability piece is going to have to be, you know, it's a to be continued kind of story. We certainly have seen, you know, prices coming down in most real estate markets, but, you know, have they come down to, you know, anything that just remains affordable? So I think that's where some of the, you know, some of the stuff of Bill 23 is good, is the ability to, you know, in one home have, you know, or one home have 3 units. And so the ability for the, you know, the owner to have it and rent from 2 other units and those types of things, or co-purchasing and those types of arrangements, you know, the rent to own and all those different types of things. And, you know, to a certain extent, holding developers true to their purchase and sale agreements. So there's, I think, elements in there. But I do think it's a to be continued story. And I don't really think, you know, I don't think anyone has any certainty that for sure these 1.5 million homes are going to be built. And even if they were, I don't think there's any guarantees that that's going to lower the price point enough for it to be defined as affordable as the case may be.
That's great. We'll give the last comment to Gary.
Thank you. Just in general terms, if you look at what goes into the cost of a house, and I'm talking market affordable, I'm not talking other affordable housing forms. 40% of the cost of the house is land. 30% plus or minus is the bricks and the sticks, and then the 30% is soft costs. So that would be your HST and your DCs and all the soft costs associated with it. So the land component obviously has a really big influence on the price of a house. So just, you know, basic economics, the more land available, in theory, the value of the land should fall, or the availability of the land should fall. So too should the house price. And I know many people will argue, well, that's, you know, that's great, but you're just developers and you'll just kind of absorb that into your profit. You know, okay, so you can subscribe to that, but eventually the market tells you what they're willing to pay for the house, not what we can charge. It's what the market's willing to pay. So it comes down to, I believe, a lot of what we're talking about, and that's why I kind of said the efficient use of land is important, because for every acre of land we take out of the equation is less land that's available for housing, and that then ends up being more and more expensive for the remaining units. So I look at it as, I don't think we're going to fix the problem. I think I agree with Michelle 100%. I think the days of free money is gone. I think, you know, we're never going to see interest rates at 2% ever again in our lifetime. And I think we've got to realize that there's going to be an adjustment necessary. But one of the benefits of Bill 23, excuse me, or the associated MCR work, which predates that stuff, is doing exactly that, bringing on all forms of housing, including greenfield and intensification. And I think just market forces will force, I believe, downward pressure on price.
Okay, wonderful. So there were a lot of questions, unfortunately, that we didn't get to, but I think that's wonderful because it shows how engaged the audience was with everything that you guys were sharing, and as well as the chat, as I said, was lighting up as you guys were talking. I think as planners, we always love to talk. We always love to hear one another's opinions, and so this was a really welcome opportunity to have some of those chats. And I do encourage those you know, who are tuning in to continue those chats in your workplace, as well as with your family. Whoever will listen to your opinion on planning, just you go ahead and you share it and you listen to theirs as well. So I want to sort of wrap up my portion of the webinar just by acknowledging, obviously, you know, the government has identified that we're in a housing crisis, but there are always opportunities in a crisis. And so we've talked about it a little bit today, but conservation authorities do have a long history of working with provincial government and with Ontarians to assist Ontario when they're in crisis. Our origins are, you know, from the Second World War and helping veterans to return. We were obviously there when we had catastrophic issues with Hurricane Hazel, and we also moved quickly following the outcomes of the Walkerton inquiry. So it's my hope that conservation authorities can continue to assist the province and all Ontarians as we turn our minds to Ontario's latest challenge, which is ensuring that there's adequate housing for our population. So with that, I'm going to hand things back to Sarah to close out the webinar, but I just want to once again give the panelists a wonderful thank you on behalf of everybody who's attended, as well as our attendees. And take care, everybody.
Thanks, Leslie. That was a really great discussion, everyone. For me, the conversation today really highlighted some of the challenges that we have before us, but that by working as a planning community, we can really work towards meeting these housing goals without jeopardizing public safety, environmental protection, and the other core values that we have when we're building communities. As Michelle and Glenn both noted, good land use planning is really a balancing act. And the question that we have moving forward is how do we restore that balance? So I'd like to take a moment today to thank the panelists. We realize it's a very busy time of year for everybody, and we really appreciate that you're able to make the time to participate in our webinar, and especially since the content changed a little bit from the time we pitched this to you. So thanks for being flexible. And thanks to our participants for spending the morning with us and for your thoughtful questions and comments. The fact that we had almost 500 people register today and over 300 people sit through the entire webinar is really a good sign of the relevance of the information that was being discussed today. So we hope everybody's gained some takeaways that you can apply in your own personal or professional realm to turn these ideas into action. So this webinar has been brought to you by the Latornell Conservation Symposium Steering Committee in partnership with Conservation Ontario. And I'd like to thank everyone who made this happen, including Leslie Rich and Jane Lewington at Conservation Ontario, and Angela, of course, and Mario Maye of Allset Inc. The recording of this webinar will be distributed by email and will be posted on Latornell's website and our YouTube channel, where you can also watch previous webinars from this year and the previous 2 years. So please share those with your networks. This ends the 2022 Latornell Conservation Symposium program. You can find out about next year's event by staying connected with us and by signing up for our newsletter at www.latornell.ca, and you can follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. One last thing before you leave today, if you're still around, please give us your feedback on today's webinar by completing the short poll. It'll help inform our future events moving forward. So thanks everyone for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.